Hello Mari, it's lovely to be here in Carmarthen
Hello.
talking to you. And I'd like to ask you a few questions about your poetry and writing in general. Your first solo publication was the children's book, Percy the Pom-Pom Bear. I'd love to know about your writer's journey before this. What led you to becoming a writer?
Okay. My writer's journey. I've always written for as long as I can remember. I wrote when I was little. I wrote as a child through primary school. I used to write kind of poetry pamphlets that I used to draw on and colour in. And I'm not saying they were necessarily any good, but I've always written. And as a teenager, then I kind of used writing as a way to process all the difficulties that I had. I had quite a turbulent, difficult time as a teenager, a lot of mental health issues. I know a lot of teenagers kind of suffer in that way, but really quite a dark time for me. And poetry was kind of my way of navigating that. So I used to write, and I'd almost kind of post it online on forums in a bit of maybe a cry for help in a way. I hoped that my friends would see it, or, you know, I'm being very honest now. So yeah, it's always been a way for me to kind of navigate through the darker times. So that was kind of how I began writing. I studied creative writing then at university, tried to hone my craft a little bit. And I think now it's become something that not only helps me to navigate the darker times, but to process and to commemorate as well. So I was kind of worried that when I had children, I wouldn't have any inspiration anymore, which now, looking back, is a ridiculous notion because they've been nothing but inspirational. And I use poetry now to write about the darker times, but also the lighter times and the good times and the relief.
Your first poetry collection, Salacia, is that how you say?
Salacia or Salacia, I think, is okay.
Thank you. Salacia was shortlisted for the Wales Book of the Year in 2019. Have you always felt at ease with both forms, poetry and fiction?
No, not necessarily. I think at ease is quite a strong statement to make. I tend to flip back and forth, actually, I think, between poetry and fiction. For me, I gravitate more towards poetry. You know, if I'm writing about a particular experience, it tends to be that maybe an image will come into my mind, or a couple of words, the beginning of a poem, a line, and it'll kind of unfold from there. So it tends to be poetry that I gravitate towards more, and I think because I have written more poetry, it's probably the form that I currently feel most at ease with. That said, I also write fiction, but I think I find it a little bit more challenging. I'm always up for a challenge though. But yeah, I think poetry at the moment is probably my main focus. I'd like to become more at ease with fiction, and particularly long form fiction, and kind of sustaining something for the length of, you know, a full length novel or something longer than a short story. Flash, Christine Keeler astride an Arnie Jacobson chair, 1963. A sunless studio in Soho, smoke curling at the stairwell, trumpet creeping like vines from the ground floor. Flash, I did as I was told, stood stripped and bare as a newborn foal, straddled the chair, leant into its unyielding grain, fizzed at its rigid geometry, the way it cinched the waist, shielding the softest parts of me, the powdery folds of my belly, glared at the camera lens like a lover, unabashed. In 29 frames, he captured every fragment, my upper lip bowed like a harp, the small crease between my eyebrows like the pleat of a sheet, defiant wrinkle pressed to my nose. Later, they listed all the men I'd taken to bed, asked, are there any you actually loved? Are there any who loved you?
I was particularly touched by the poem for Sarah Everard from your 2022 collection, Pearl and Bones, a book which is at once intimate in its depiction of young motherhood, yet political in its deeply feminist tone. Did you start out to organically combine the two themes?
No, I didn't set out to do that, actually. I think what happened was I had my first son during the COVID pandemic, right in the middle of 2020 in the July. And I wrote a lot about that. I found it was inspirational, having this new little life to care for. And it was also a really difficult time because we were in the middle of a pandemic. I became a mother for the first time. I had no support around me. So I wrote a lot. And initially the collection was called The Shape of a Mother, because it was kind of all about motherhood. And then I began to write more and more. And I think what happened was I realised that mothers in particular were particularly sidelined during the COVID pandemic, and that's something I've written a lot about in terms of non-fiction as well. But I felt we were very kind of marginalised, very sidelined, just at the bottom of the list of priorities. And so I started to think more then about women generally. I've always written about women and kind of marginalised female characters, but it kind of came to me more that women were very much pushed aside in society generally in terms of what kind of society deems worthwhile, I suppose, parenting, but especially mothering, right at the bottom of the list. So I started to write more about various women because of that, and to look at violence against women, and to look especially at forms of violence that were to do with controlling women's bodies, female bodily autonomy. So the current political situation in America with the overturning of Roe versus Wade played into that. So yeah, the whole book is kind of a string of narratives about my experience of motherhood and mothering through the pandemic, and then also violence against women, coercion, the loss of female bodily autonomy. And I just realised it ties together. It can't kind of not tie together. Poem for Sarah Everard. Tonight, she is not afraid to walk these streets alone, knows their contours like the valleys of her own body, alleys and gullies familiar as old lovers. The lights hook her cheekbones, stars sputter. He approaches, palms outstretched, vowing only to serve, to protect. So this is how it ends, her bones split to dust, ground like a beetle to the earth, voice wilting in his grip. She cannot know how her name will echo in the mouths of strangers, how it will grow like a daisy, clawing back relentless through the soil.
I'd love to know how you came to write about the female body the way you do.
I've always had a bit of a fixation with physicality. I think using physicality in poetry really strengthens it. The way we feel things, the way we feel emotions viscerally and physically, that has a great impact in terms of language. But equally for me, the whole concept of the body, and particularly the female body, has always been a bit of a fascination. As a teenager, going back to my teenage years again, when I kind of struggled very much with my mental health, I had very poor body image. I suffered from body dysmorphia, I had disordered eating, I've had that kind of all throughout my adulthood. And I've tried to kind of come away from that and overcome that as much as possible, but it's really difficult in a society which just continuously polices women's bodies. And postpartum now, I've had 2 children in the space of 2 years, so my body has changed drastically. It's done amazing things, but it's also changed, and that's something that I'm still struggling to come to terms with. You know, I've got poems about it because it's something that I've had to kind of navigate my way through, and writing poetry helps me to do that. But yeah, I think that's why I'm so sort of focused on the female body.
So can we expect more poems about the female body in the future?
I imagine so, yes. I think I've written a couple more poems since the publication of Pearl and Bone. More poems about my second son, because Pearl and Bone is kind of entirely about my first son, but I've had another baby since. But yes, I imagine there will be more poems on the same kind of themes and topics, and, you know, inspiration ebbs and flows, but I imagine there'll be similar poems to come. Page of Wands. So this is who he'll be, standing centre stage, flushing apricot and gold, commanding the skies. When he tells the barren land to bloom, it will listen. There is a reason he perched at the very top of the deck, leapt like a hare to meet you. He is within you. See how he presses his scroll to his chest, how leaves sprout from his staff like poetry, like song. He will pluck words from you like daffodils from the earth. Just wait. He will set your world on fire.
Who are your poetry inspirations?
Poetry inspirations. There's a lot of poets I really admire. I would say Fiona Benson is right at the top of the list. Rebecca Goss's poetry collections. Joanna Ingham is a poet that I feel like she doesn't get as much recognition as she deserves. Her collection is a pamphlet collection, Naming Bones, is just absolutely phenomenal. It is gorgeous. And she's got another one called Ovarium, which is all about gynecological issues. So it's quite niche, but her work is just phenomenal. I love the work of Natalie Ann Holbrow, who I know you've interviewed in the past. Natalie and I wrote a collaborative pamphlet because we felt that our styles kind of worked quite well together. And I definitely feel inspired by her writing whenever I read it. I think reading widely improves your own writing, definitely. Yeah.
Yes, I think I've having read that pamphlet, that collaborative pamphlet, I think it's something poets don't do very often, but when they do, it seems to work so well. I feel particularly that instance. And also, I was going to say, I think Fiona Benson is, isn't she shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize?
Oh, is she?
I
don't know, I haven't seen this year's shortlist, but quite possibly, it wouldn't surprise me. A body postpartum. I am learning now to recognise someone new, to meet her in the mirror and say, this is where he grew like a fledgling rolling cartwheels day and night. This pocket of flesh you turn from, his first home. These doorframe hips, his foundations. Beneath your waistband, he learned your voice, spent months conjuring your face in his dreams. This is where his limbs stretched like oars, where he paddled the darkness. In the pleats of these scars, he felt your love streaming, rich and hot along the umbilicus. When she glares from the glass, I am learning to welcome her, like an old friend, changed.
What are you working on at present?
At the moment, I am working on a novel which I'm writing for my PhD. The whole PhD has taken me longer than planned because I've had to take 2 bouts of maternity leave. So the novel is taking longer than planned, but I'm working on a novel set in 16th-century Wales, and it's all about the witch trials. Witch trials in Wales weren't massive. There wasn't a lot of them. There was only, I think, 5 prosecutions. It was quite kind of bottom of the radar in Wales, really. But I'm really fascinated by the witch trials and the way that the society and government officials kind of went after women the way they did. So I'm writing about that, and I'm exploring the correlation between fertility and reproduction and accusations of witchcraft. So the ways in which women who didn't fit the kind of gendered norms were accused of being witches. So maybe postmenopausal women, you know, that kind of traditional hag spinster image, or women who had, you know, more intellect than society liked them to have, more independence. So yeah, I'm really enjoying working on that, and I'm just over halfway through. So I'm hoping that'll be published at some point.
Well, I'm wishing you all the best with that, and thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.